Since coming into power in the 1959 general election, Singapore's People's Action Party has established a successful business-led developmental state. Within one generation now, Singapore transformed from a dirt-poor at independence country to a highly developed economy that we see today. And after coming into power, the People's Action Party ditched the rigid ideological view that almost all independence parties of the left, whether in Asia or in Africa, held that only the state should lead development. Well, the party transformed itself from a party of independence to partner private business and used multinational companies to lead industrialization. For the whole of 2021, the Singapore economy expanded by 7.6%, rebounding from the 4.1% contraction in 2020. The manufacturing sector grew by 13.2%, accelerating from 7.5% growth in 2020. And I've got to say that the first quarter shrinking a little bit, but still very, very impressive. So maybe the question is, what can the ANC-led government here in South Africa learn from Singapore? Well, to answer this and more, we're now joined by Professor William Gumede, who's an associate professor at the School of Governance at the University of the Witwatersrand and is also author of South Africa in BRICS. Prof, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Good to talk to you. So we can learn a lot from Singapore, and when they started their journey, sadly they were on a par with a lot of countries are still today, and they managed to do things. What are those things you think that we can learn from them?
Good evening, and thank you for having me. Let me wish all of the viewers a blessed long weekend. I think we can learn so much from Singapore, particularly from Singapore's governing party, the People's Action Party. Certainly for me, in the post-war, one of the most successful independence movements than governments. I don't think anywhere around the world have we seen such a successful former independence party. And it was almost the same as the ANC or any other African liberation movement. It was a party of the left. It had trade unions, it had communists, it had small business people, it had traditionalists. So almost like a broad church in the same way that the ANC was a broad church, or ZANU-PF was a broad church, or Frelimo was a broad church. But the irony is, if you look at the African liberation movements like the ANC or like a Frelimo and so on, have not been as successful as the Singapore's liberation movement. Now, there's a couple of things. Let's just take about 5 of them. The first thing is with the People's Action Party in Singapore is that they dealt with corruption the moment they got into power, very, very importantly. And many of the African liberation movements, and even here at home with the ANC, did not take corruption seriously. A lot of people say, well, so what? Corruption doesn't kill people. Of course, corruption does kill people, and it kills jobs also. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, they were much more honest when they governed Singapore, and again, many of the liberation movements, leaders, they say something. The African liberation movement, they would say a policy, but they're not really honest about implementing. I mean, they're just saying it to please their supporters, and so on. There's no genuineness. And then thirdly, the People's Action Party, what they did is, they were very pragmatic, so they were not very ideologically fixed ideologically. So they were not stuck in the past. They were really grounded in the present and very pragmatic. And they look at what can work on evidence base, not on rhetoric or on ideology. And then also they did 2 other things, which I think is very important. They brought the best people into the governing party. So they looked across the country and found the best people, but it also brought the best people into government. You know, people, they introduced a system where you have to write, if, for example, you finish matric, the equivalent of matric, the top people in matric gets recruited into the public service. So, really important. So about 5, I think, really crucial elements which would be missing in South Africa, but also be missing in many African independence and liberation movements.
Why do you think we failed to do it? What were the pressures that we faced that we weren't able to do it? I mean, the first one continues to be a headache, and I've heard some really horrific numbers in terms of how much corruption has destroyed our continent. How were they able to succeed, and why have we failed?
I mean, I'm going to have to tell our viewers, just in terms of, to try to imagine, Singapore, I know it's not a country, but, in the late 1950s, Singapore was poorer than countries like Ghana, or poorer than most African countries. 90% of the people in the 1950s in Singapore, 90% of all Singaporeans lived in informal settlements, squatter camps. You can have to imagine that 90% of people live in a squatter camp of the whole country. I mean, that is where they came from. And within 30 years, their income was equivalent of Germany, one of the industrial countries, top industrial countries in the world. I mean, that's an absolutely amazing generation. So somebody who was born in the 1950s, when Singapore was among the poorest countries in the world, when that person reads 30 years old, Singapore was an industrial country, a developed country. I mean, that's extraordinary. And as I say, the first thing it really is that Singapore was as corrupt in the 1950s and the 1960s as any African country or any other kind of developing country. So what they did is almost immediately, in the first years of coming to power, they cleaned up their own party. So even if people had struggle credentials, if they turned out to be corrupt, they were immediately fired and prosecuted and jailed. I mean, so senior leaders of the People's Action Party, although they had long struggle credentials and they were part of the struggle, they were leaders of the struggle, they were sent to jail. The second thing that they did almost immediately was clean up corruption across society. So what they did, clean up corruption in the governing party itself by taking out all of the corrupt leaders. First thing. Second, what they did is corruption across society, across business, civil society, corruption outside the state. So that's what they did. And maybe the third thing what they did is, and you're going to have to imagine this, is they decided to retire almost all of their struggle leaders who were not competent. And what they did is they recruited a whole new leadership. Leaders were mostly not members of their party. So what they did is they essentially just actually said, well, let's open up our recruitment. Let's call for interviews across the country, and let's just get the best people and people who are not members of the governing party. Let's get them and appoint them to the national executive and make them the new leaders of the party, pushing out all of these old struggle veterans and people with struggle credentials, but who were not competent enough or who were corrupt.
They also interestingly looked to the private sector to lead development in the country, something that we struggle with on the continent. Is it because we look to countries like China and we feel that socialism is the way to go and that the state is the only one that can be trusted? Why is it that China can work and we failed at this socialist project?
I mean, the extraordinary thing about Singapore's developmental state now is developmental status, of course, is the kind of status has in the post-Second War period in Southeast Asia that has led their economic miracle. They turned about 5 or 6 of the countries in East Asia, including Singapore, from poor into industrial countries. Now, I think, contrary to popular belief in South Africa, in the ANC, and also in broader in South Africa, where people think a developmental state can only be delivered by the government. Now, in Singapore, when the People's Action Party came to power, there were no businesses owned by indigenous people. So what they then did is they said, well, let's have a partnership with foreign businesses. And then we build a developmental state with foreign businesses. Let them, because they have the money, they have the capacity, they have the resources. Let's use the capacity to deliver public services. They use the capacity to create jobs, to create new industries. Now, what has happened with the ANC and many other liberation movements, what they did, the first thing they came to power, they either nationalize businesses that were not, they were in private hands. They were opposed to the private sector and so on, and they were opposed to entrepreneurship. Now, importantly, Singapore focused on entrepreneurship so much. Now, the thing with entrepreneurship changes society, because the moment you produce, you make something, then you sell the thing, and if you sell it abroad to other countries, it changes a country, brings the money in. You need new skills. It brings a positive growth loop by creating something. Now, let's just look in the South African context, for example, since 1994, when the ANC came to power. So instead of going for entrepreneurship, what it did, it actually used the state to create more social services, so didn't focus really on creating the entrepreneurship, or the ANC pushed for Black economic empowerment by giving or asking established businesses to give stakes, to Blacks, South Africans. But that's not entrepreneurship. That's not creating something new. That is taking what is already existing and then giving it to other people. Now, what the difference with Singapore and the difference with all of those developmental states in Southeast Asia that's been so successful, they created from the start new industries. So if let's just say if Singapore would have had a Black economic empowerment strategy, and the way they would have done it was to say, well, to create new industries that did not exist. So not to take slices of existing industries and give it to local people or indigenous people and so on, but to create entirely new industries that never ever existed in a country. So that kind of empowerment changes the society because it creates the jobs, it creates new businesses, and it makes a society competitive.
It's a great story, but maybe there are some ingredients that are unique to Singapore. And one of them, some people might say that Lee Kuan Yew was a benevolent dictator. He was in firm control, and that's why he was able to achieve so much. We've seen some people might even say Paul Kagame is that guy, and look what he's been able to do. Could that be a contributing factor, that you've got someone in charge, but is genuinely in charge, that's got a good heart?
I don't think autocratic leaders govern better. Now, just look at the history of Africa. I mean, most of the African leaders since the end of colonialism were strong type of military leaders, autocratic leaders, people who take control of the countries, Robert Mugabe or Nyerere, and so they were strong leaders, but they were ineffective leaders. So it is not the leadership that we need. So we have to look at strong differently. So strong, it means inclusive. Now that's strong. So that is the most important thing. It's not strong leader because you shout a slogan or you call for violence or you attack other people or you're the most revolutionary person. So that is a story of African leaders. They're trying to be revolutionary, they're trying to be military, and to show their strength in that way. That has been an absolute massive failure to have that kind of leadership. So what kind of strong leadership we need, and it's a strong leadership that we saw in Japan after the Second World War, in Singapore also, is a strong leadership that governs in the interest of every single individual. So if they don't look at the way if you're not the same color as them, or you don't look like them, if you don't speak like, they govern people, leaders who govern in the interest of everyone in the country. That's the first thing. The second thing is total honesty when you govern. And the third thing is not to favor your own comrades, your own constituencies, your own region, or your own people, whether they look like you or talk like you, but to really govern in the interest of every person in the country. Then fourthly is, and I said it earlier, is to create new industries and to allow the talent of everyone to flower. Because the thing about development is not about the money or whether you have the money or not. It is to bring the right people with the right skills and the right mindset and the right entrepreneurial flair into the right places, because the right people can come up with the solutions.
Yeah. My last question, you've probably answered already in a different way, because I was about to talk about continuity. And you've got China, and it doesn't matter whether it's Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin or Xi Jinping. The Chinese Communist Party has a plan for the country going for the next 50 years. And no matter who's in charge, they just work the plan and it's working. And maybe this is what the PAP has done well in Singapore. They've had the ability to have the continuity and continue with the plan. But I'm answering my own question, because ZANU-PF has been in charge of Zimbabwe for 42 years, didn't get the same results. So I don't know, there must be something to continuity. But again, as you say, continuity is good, but it must also have the right people.
Absolutely. To have a plan is really important. I mean, that's actually, I'll tell you, extraordinary. If you look at all of the countries, the 54, 55 African countries since the Second World War, do you know that only 3 countries actually had a development plan? You just have to imagine that.
Wow.
54 countries, only 3. So, and some countries, of course, they come up with a plan, but the plans are really slogans. It's not based on a reality, not based on evidence. And the development plans doesn't involve the whole of society, only the government party. They come up with their own plan. The plan is very much an ideology. It is not on practical. It's not on a real world, and so on. And they're not even serious about implementing the plan. They go through election campaigns with their plan, and so on. I mean, just look at our country. ANC came to government in 1994. Now, when was the National Development Plan? National Development Plan came in 2009.
Yeah.
So there's been no plan from 1994 then to 2009. I mean, that is astonishing. But that is the story also of almost every African country, except obviously Botswana, Cape Verde, Mauritius, and more recently Tunisia. Who actually came up with serious plans, and they put the skills. They brought in skills, people who are competent, to run these. Or to deliver on the plans. They kept it honest. They dealt with corruption, and in those plans, they reviewed the plans regularly to see that the targets were met. And the managers who didn't meet the targets or were ineffective and incompetent were fired. they were held accountable, which of course in our case in South Africa, people are not being held accountable.
So there's a blueprint, there's a plan, Singapore's proof of concept. Perhaps we just need to elect the right leaders to do the same here in Africa. Prof. Gumede, always good talking to you. Thank you so much indeed for joining us. All right, that's Professor William Gumede sharing his thoughts about Singapore's sterling story, 1959 to 2022. The growth has been immense, enormous, and one would have hoped that Africa might have gone the same route. But sadly, as he said, 3 out of 54 countries have bothered to come up with a national plan.